Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video we're going to look at how to automatically generate our TypeScript types from a GraphQL schema. This video is for people that already know a little bit about using GraphQL in a React app with the Apollo library, and also know a little bit about TypeScript. Don't have to be an expert, but at least know sort of the high-level basics of what's going on when I talk about a TypeScript typed and whatnot. So if we get started, we're going to be using the Shopify storefront API. They've got a nice GraphQL API that I've written a query to pull some products down. So I'm pulling the first 10 products and I'm grabbing a few details about them. And I'm including this fragment here, which just grabs some images information. So if I run that, we see the result over here on the right where we've got all the information about the products that I pulled from the API. And if you've ever worked with GraphQL before, you know that all of the fields are typed. So if we look at the title here, it's a string, and it's got an exclamation on the end, which means it's not null, it's always going to be there. If we go to, let's see, I think they're all strings, but we've even got some custom types here. Actually, here, if we hover first. So first is an integer, it's expecting a number that's, we're passing in 10 to pull the first 10 products. And we've also got some custom scalar types, which is when they've sort of overridden the default string and number and Boolean types, and they've defined their own. So here we have a datetime type, which it's an ISO 8601 encoded UTC datetime string. And we've also got over here with the transform SRC. This is it's also a string, but it happens to be a URL that we're getting back. So we're going to take this query, and I've already sort of built up the basics of what we need to run it in a React app. So if we go over to the finished product, here we can see that we're just pulling the products down and showing 3 images from each one, which matches the query I wrote. So let's look at the code and then look at how we can auto-generate types for this GraphQL query. So if we bring up the code, make this a little bit, that's big enough. Okay, so I'm not going to go over the basics of how to set up Apollo. I've got some other videos on that. Specifically, I've got my app here in a Create React app, and I've imported a Create Client function. So if we were to go over to Apollo Client, this is all of the code required to sort of set up the Apollo client, which is going to make requests to the GraphQL API that Shopify has. So I'm not going to go into any sort of details here. I'll link below and in this video to another video about how to set up the client if you want more details about that. And if you've never set up TypeScript before in a Create React app or Gatsby or Next or anything like that, I'll also link to an article I've written on how to get up and running on that. So if we come back to our app, we've got our client and I've included my Apollo provider. And within the Apollo provider, I actually have a second provider. And that's because I'm a real big fan of, instead of using the query component, the mutation component, to actually use hooks to pull the data down. I think it makes the code a little bit cleaner, and they have their own provider to be able to handle that. So we're wrapping both of our providers around the products component. And if we go over here, this is the component that performs the GraphQL query. So if we start at the top, we've got our typical import of React, the use query hook to basically perform the query, and GQL, which is the GraphQL tags that enables us to write the GraphQL query. So here we have our query defined. So it's the same thing I was showing over here in the browser, where we're pulling down the first 10 products and 3 images for each of those products. So we've got the same thing over here. To copy and paste, it would work exactly the same. And one thing to note right at the top, I've had to define a named query, and that'll be important as we advance a little bit in this demo, because it basically creates the types and prefixes everything with the name you give it here. But we'll come back to that. So we've got our query, and we come down to our component, which is the products component. And at the top, since we're using hooks, we perform the query using the use query hook. we pass in the actual query produced by the GraphQL tag. We pass some variables that we're passing to the query. So here we're just saying that when we get the image back, specifically the source of the image, I've done a little bit of resizing of the image and I've passed in the preferred content type. So here I'm asking for a JPEG, and I've done SSR false, and is that the, I think that's for suspense false. I think that's the one it is. Oh, no, I actually want suspend false because I don't want this to use suspense. I want just to get the data back in sort of two different ways. So I'm getting the data back here. This is the actual data, the result of the query, but I'm also getting back a loading Boolean variable, which tells me whether or not it's completed the query yet. So if we go below this hook, we've got a little if statement check to find out if the query is finished running yet. So I'm saying if it's still loading or there's no data, return loading products. So below here, we can sort of assume that we have all the data back. So I'm going through and I'm mapping all of the products that I've received. And then for each of the products, I'm mapping the images. And you can see here that I've actually just right now defined each of the products as an any type, and then each of the images as an any type as well. So this is obviously, it makes your code pass. The TypeScript is happy, but you've sort of you've ruined sort of any benefit that you get from TypeScript, because at this point we don't really know what a product is. It could be anything. And in that sense, we don't know what an ID is or a title, because they're all taking on the any. So the goal of this is basically to auto-generate the type so that I don't even need to define what the data is. It's just going to automatically know what it's getting back and also what variables I'm sending to the query. And I don't have to write out anything myself. In the past for projects, I've gone and I've defined my own interfaces to sort of mimic what the data looks like coming back. So I'd be like interface, products, data, and then I'd have to think about, okay, we've got products, and this has edges. And then what is edges? It's an array of nodes, and you'd have to define everything yourself and say that the ID's a string, the title's a string, etc. It's really time consuming, and it's sort of annoying because GraphQL is typed to begin with, as I mentioned. So if we could just use the types that are already defined in GraphQL, it avoids having to write anything ourselves. So that's what we're doing. Let's get started. So if I go over here to the package.json, the first thing that I've already done is I've included this Apollo package. And what this is actually, if I go over to GitHub here, so it's actually the Apollo tooling package, and it comes with a bunch of command line tools for development of Apollo GraphQL apps. And one of the commands is Apollo client code gen. So this is the command we'll be using, and it allows you to generate types from a GraphQL schema. So I've already installed Apollo. That gives me the commands. And if I come down here to scripts, I've created one called Apollo generate. And right now it doesn't really do anything. It just says Apollo code gen generate. And on its own, without passing a bunch of options, it's probably going to fail. So we just say Apollo generate. Cool. So we're already getting a bunch of errors. And the first error is that we have to tell it what sorts of types we're using. So you can use, you can see these 4 types here. We're working with TypeScript. So we can pass that in, that we're going to be using target TypeScript. So we can run it again. And there's a bunch of other errors. It doesn't know what schema to use. Basically, where does it look to find out what schema you're using and what types it has, etc. So we need to point it towards the Shopify GraphQL API. So there's a bunch of options we need to pass for it to work. successfully. I've written them down because they're hard to remember. I'll just pull up the article I'm working on here. Where are we? There we go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to add, the option, is we're going to tell it which code to basically exclude. And we don't want it to look at anything node modules at all. So we'll copy that over, and our command is to exclude anything in the node modules folder as it's generating all of the types. The second thing we can do is we can tell it what to include. So where to look at our code to figure out what queries we're running and how to generate types for those queries. So we'll paste that in here to our command that's going to be growing pretty big. The next, and this actually fixes the error that we've got in the console right now. It doesn't know what schema to use. So we can tell it to go look at an endpoint, and we give it the URL to the Shopify GraphQL API. Okay, paste that in. So in order to use the Shopify GraphQL API, you actually have to pass an access token. So here I've already sort of pre-generated it, and this is to their demo store. And the way I actually got that is I was looking at their GraphQL Explorer, and I actually just popped open the network tab. I ran a query, and I looked at, it's this one here. I looked at the request they were making, and I grabbed the access token here. So this isn't anything really secretive at all. It's just something they're using in their demo, and you'd want to obviously replace that with an environment variable if this were your real production application. So I've got this header in here, and I've configured the Apollo command to send that header along with the request to the endpoint here to get the schema. So we'll paste that in. So I've already done this target TypeScript. The second one is we want to tell it what tag we're using, because in the products, you can see that I'm importing GraphQL tag, but I've imported it as GQL. So I can call it sort of whatever I want. And I have to tell the Apollo CodeGen library what tag I'm using so that it can go and find the queries, parse them to be able to find the types that it needs. So that's what that does. So if I come back to the article, I'll copy over the tag name like that. And then come back here. So the last thing option I'm going to pass is output flat. So when it generates the different types, you can choose to have it sort of create a whole bunch of different files alongside each of the type files alongside each of the files that sort of define the queries. So if you had like nested folders, it would generate files and put the type files in each of those different folders. What I prefer, and it comes with its own caveats, is basically to just have them all within a single folder. I like this because it makes it so that I know where to look. It's all in one place. And if I ever want to sort of just wipe it out and start fresh, I can just delete that one folder and regenerate it. So this is going to output all of the type files inside of src generated. So this folder here that's currently empty. So let's paste that in and run the command again. So I run the command. Now I'm running it with all of those different options. So this time it was able to generate the query, and it wrote 3 different files. Before we move on and look at the files it generated, one thing I should note is that I've got this apollo.config.js file in the root of my project. And if I didn't have this, so if I just renamed it to something else, Apollo. So if I were to rerun this, I'm going to get an error, I believe. Not at all. Okay, maybe it doesn't need this. Let's try deleting it. Okay, maybe I was wrong. Guess you don't need that. But in the past, I've gotten an error saying it's looking for Apollo config for the command I'm running. guess it's not needed, and I must have screwed something up when I was doing it before. So you can ignore that. All right, so back to what it produced. So it created 3 files for us in this generated folder. The first is global types. So in here, it's going to place all of the generated types that don't really have anything to do with the specific query that you are writing. In here, you're going to get a lot of like enums and things that are global across the GraphQL schema. So in here, it's basically saying that it's going to have enums and input objects. So in here, because our query specifically for when we're getting the SRC of the image, we've passed in that we want the preferred content type to be a. And so I've defined a variable up here, preferred content type, which is a type of image content type. So this is an enum value that can consist of a JPG, a PNG, or a WebP file. So it's defined a type for that right here. And if we look at our query again, you can see that I named the query products data. So it created a file with the same name, and this is where it is defining all of the types from this query. So some of the names can get pretty long, but if we scroll down to the bottom, you can see that at the very beginning it creates as an interface for it, products data. And what does this interface have? It has some products, which is type of products data products. So we can come up here and see that this contains edges, and each edge contains a node, and each node contains all of the fields that I asked for each of the products. So here we've got an ID of string, title of string, description of string. And here's where it gets a little bit weird for the first time. We've got updated at, which is a type of any. And that's not really useful, but why did it give us a type of any? And the reason for that is because if you come back here and you look at what is an updated at, well, it's a custom scalar value called datetime, which is really just a string, but GraphQL isn't really able to tell what datetime should be. Like, is it based on a number? Is it based on a Boolean or a string? So it doesn't know, so it says any. And there's actually a couple options you can pass to this code_gen generate command to have it pass through those types that are defined in the GraphQL schema so that we have access to those actual types inside of our TypeScript code. So to see how to do that, we will go back to the article that I'm working on. And there's 2 more options we can do. So there's pass through custom scalars that we'll add. And then actually let's run it with that to see what issues if you only pass this one. Okay, so it's generating the files. So if we go back here, we can see that updated at is now a datetime. So it can't define it doesn't know what type this is. Datetime. Okay, I have no clue what that is. So we could define datetime, but come down here specifically to the image transformed source, which is a URL. So it says it's an interface URL. Well, we know that it's supposed to be a string, but because sort of in this Node or React environment, it's already predefined what a URL is, we're going to run into some conflicts between Shopify's custom scalar types and types that may already exist in Node or in React or whatnot. So the way to get around this is to actually pass a second option, and that's to prefix all of these custom scalar values with some piece of text. So if we come back here, and we're going to prefix all these custom scalars with a type of Shopify. So we'll run that again. It's regenerating all of the types for us. And if we go and look at those files again, so we can see now that it's a Shopify URL, and this is a Shopify datetime. So now we have unique names for these custom scalar values. So we can go and we can define what these should be. So you may be tempted to sort of, okay, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to define right above what is this Shopify URL. But the problem is this file gets generated every time, and as it says here, should not be edited. So we can go into, in this case, the global.d.ts file, which is where you can define global types used in your app. And we can come here and we can say, okay, type Shopify URL is actually just a string, and type Shopify datetime is actually just a string as well. So if we go back here to products data, you can see that when I hover this now, I know that the Shopify URL is a string. And where's that date time? And I know that the date time is also a string now as well. So now we've generated all of these types and they're good enough to use in our application. So if we just close everything for a fresh start and open up products. So remember at the beginning, I said that I had defined any, and this is what we wanted to avoid in TypeScript because it's not really helpful at all. And if we come down here and hover, it's still saying that it's any. And that's because when you perform the query, in this case using hooks, but I'll show you how to do it with the query component just after this, we can pass in right here. So between the name of the function we're calling and the parentheses of the function, we can pass in two different types to this function to basically tell it what type of data we're expecting to get back and what type of data the variables are that it expects to receive. So the first thing I need to do is come up here and import the types that I'm going to be passing to the useQuery hook. So I'm going to import them from generated products data, and it always has the same name of the query that you've written. So what do I want to import? I want to import the products data type and the products data variables. So this is the response you're going to get back from the query, and this is the variables that want to be passed to the query. This is this right here that we're expecting to send it a preferred content type, which is an image content type, which is one of those JPEG or PNG enum values. So now that we have these imported, we can come back down to these angly brackets here, and we can pass in the products data type and the products data variables type that is the variables. Okay, so now that we've done this, we've produced an issue for us, but if we hover the data, we can see now that it's either going to get back the products data type or undefined. And the reason it's or undefined is because when it's loading the query, it doesn't yet have a value. It's still undefined. So that's why I have this check here. And I'll show you a little trick about this and the reason it's not complaining lower. First, let's clear up this issue. So it's saying argument of type variables, preferred content type string of JPEG is not assignable to type because the types are incompatible. Preferred content type is not a string of JPEG, it must be an image content type. So it's really complaining about this little string value here. And what we can do to fix that is we can import the global types that were generated, and we'll grab specifically the image content type enum. So now that we have this, instead of passing a string of JPEG, we can pass this dot JPEG, which is one of the types that it's expecting to receive, and now it's happy. Okay, so the last thing we can do is we can actually remove this any here and this any here. And because we know what type of data is, it's products data or undefined, we can come down here and we can hover, and you can see at this point it knows that it's products data. So how did it get rid of that or undefined? The reason is because I've written a check for it here. So if I were to only say if loading, return loading products, you can see here it's complaining that it's possibly undefined. So if I just add this check-in, if it's loading or there's no data, that covers the case of if it's undefined, it's going to return loading. So now when it gets down here, it knows for sure that data is the product's data. And I can hover any point of this map that I've created. Here I did a little trick because it's returning something called node, but images is also returning something called node. I've actually given them an alias to call this a product and this an image so that it's easier to deal with as I'm mapping over and I'm writing code. So if I hover the product, I can see that it is products edges node. So I could go into here and see products edges node, and I can see all of the columns I have on it, ID, title, etc. So that's why I could actually just hit dot, and it's going to pop up all of the fields I have. So all of the generated code, it tells me exactly the fields I've selected up here in my query. And if I type one of them, I can hover it and I can see that it is a string. And the cool thing is, so if I even do product dot updated at, so here I hover this and I can see that it's actually a string too. So it was that custom type of Shopify date time, but because I said, no, that's actually a string, it knows what it's getting and it can show you and generate the correct information as I hover this. Cool. So the next thing I wanted to just quickly show is that down here in images, whenever you're mapping something, as I'm mapping over each of the images, you always have to add a key to the elements side of it, right? And the key always has to be some value. But the problem with the field as Shopify has defined it, if I click on ID here, so each image has an ID. The problem is they never said that it's not null. So if I go up to this one, you can see that the product ID has an exclamation, meaning it's always going to have a value. For some reason, I don't know why, an image may not have an ID. So that is actually why I have this use the image ID or the index. Because if I leave this off, TypeScript's smart enough to know, hey, you passed a key, but the ID might actually be null. So you need to handle the case where it's not there. So I'm just using the index for that. And that's why I have that or index. All right. So a few of the gotchas I wanted to point out were, I think we covered them already, but just to quickly go over them again. You always have to give your query a name. So if I were to delete that query, because you don't have to give your query a name, I don't believe, especially if you're not passing variables to it. But if I were to come down here and run the Apollo generate, let's see what it says. So Apollo does not support anonymous operations. So if you ever get that error, anonymous operations, it's because you forgot to give your query a name. The second thing I wanted to point out was the custom scalar values and how by providing a prefix, so if I go back to my command here, providing a prefix of Shopify, you can make sure that they're unique to the custom scalar types returned by your GraphQL schema. The next thing I wanted to point out that could be a gotcha is because I've said I wanted it output as a flat file, you need to make sure that anything it's sort of putting in here is unique across your whole application. So I couldn't have, and by that I mean, say I had another component, I couldn't also call it products data because now there's going to be a conflict with that name and it's going to complain. So I think if you had each in like its own folder and you weren't doing the flat output, that wouldn't be a problem because it's going to place each one in its own folder. But because it's global, you have to make sure that each query has a unique global name across your whole application. I don't mind that, giving each query a global name. because if you're reusing the same query in multiple places, maybe that's actually a sign that that should be its own component rather than repeating the code in multiple places. And I think those were the different things I wanted to cover. The last thing we could maybe do is, instead of using this hooks example, let's actually rip this out and rewrite the same thing using the query component instead, since a lot of people use that rather than hooks. So I don't need to import hooks anymore, and I want to import query. Okay, so how can you use query and tell it which types it expects to receive? And even as I hover this, you can see that to the anglet brackets, I can pass in the data that it wants or the variables. And the way they actually recommend to do this is to come down here and to define a new class that might be the products query, we'll call it. And what that is it's a class that extends query, and we can tell it what data is going to be received. So this receives products data and products data variables, and we can just give the class an empty body. So now that we have a custom query type, which is tied to this types of data being passed to it, we can come down here and use this inside of our component that we're building. So we will return, this time we are going to return this products query. And in here we need to tell it what query we're using. So I believe it's like that. And we need to give it the variables. So it's an object that receives this with, was it image content type dot JPEG. Okay. So in here you receive a function, and inside of the function we will strip out the data and the loading property from that. So in here we can actually just copy this code that we had previously out here. Okay, so I haven't tried this before, so let's see if it actually works. Let's run it and then talk about it. Yarn start. Okay, is it going to work? Yeah, cool. So this is the same code. Instead of using the useQuery hook, we've swapped it to use a custom query component that we've used by extending the query component that we imported from the library, telling it which types it's going to receive in terms of the response data and the variables we're going to pass for the query. And now that we have this custom products query class, we can use that inside of our component, giving it the query along with its variables, and then passing in the render function that we can ask for the data and the loading. And at this point, I literally copied and pasted the hooks code that I had before. So it's up to you, whatever method of performing queries and mutations you prefer. We've covered them both here and how to hook them up to use GraphQL. The last little interesting thing I wanted to show is that, say I want to ask for a different field from products, and I want to ask for the price in Canadian dollars. So I'll regenerate the types and just wait for that. All right, and we got an error. So we scroll up here and we can see cannot query field price Canadian dollars on type product. Did you mean price range? So that's a really cool thing. If you try to use a field that does not exist in the GraphQL schema, it will give you an error right at compile time. And it will even offer you suggestions on maybe you meant this field that does exist called price range instead. So that's pretty cool because you're always guaranteed to write queries that match the schema that you're querying them against. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I will have an accompanying article to go along with it that I'll link to below in the notes. Thanks and have a good day. Bye.